Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking the deeply complex legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, the man who basically built modern Singapore from the ground up. It's a really fascinating look at the ultimate political trade-off. I mean, think about it. How much of your own personal freedom would you literally be willing to sacrifice for guaranteed prosperity? We're going to examine exactly how a tiny island nation was transformed into a global powerhouse in just a single generation, and, crucially, what controversial political methods were used to actually make that happen. So, let's dive right in by setting the stage with two starkly contrasting historical views. As journalist Carlton Tan pointed out in The Guardian, for some people, Lee's legacy is simply that of a ruthless tyrant. But for others, he's the ultimate tireless leader, or a benevolent dictator. Throughout this explainer, we are going to look at this through a completely neutral lens. We're drawing directly from the historical record to objectively understand both his monumental achievements and the deeply divisive methods that defined his rule. To make sure we cover the full spectrum fairly, here is our roadmap. 1. The economic miracle. 2. The development model. 3. Authoritarian pragmatism. And 4. Singapore's changing future. Let's get right to it. Part 1. The economic miracle. A nation on the brink. Now, to really grasp the sheer scale of this achievement, you have to look at Singapore's incredibly dire starting point back in 1965. They had just gone through a sudden, traumatic separation from Malaysia, and they were, by all accounts, a typical third world country. Their gross national product per capita, a mere $300. Just let that sink in. They had absolutely no natural resources, very little wealth, and some massive domestic challenges to figure out. Lee was facing massive structural problems right out of the gate. Unemployment was absolutely staggering. Rife racial disharmony was threatening to literally tear the new nation apart. And on top of all that, an impending withdrawal of British military forces was coming in 1968, which everyone expected to severely aggravate the jobs crisis. This intense, immediate pressure basically forced Lee to make some incredibly bold decisions just to ensure his country even survived. And honestly, this perfectly illustrates how economic development doesn't just spontaneously happen. As Senior Minister Goh Chook Tong noted, and this echoes the findings of the 2008 Growth Report, having natural resources and open markets just isn't enough. Economic development has to be consciously chosen and driven by a capable government. You really need that master chef to provide absolute political stability and a clear, unwavering vision. Which brings us to part 2, the development model exporting to the world. So, how did Lee actually play the role of that master chef? Well, he took a massive, and at the time, deeply unpopular gamble on foreign direct investment and export-oriented manufacturing. To convince massive multinational companies to set up shop in Singapore, the government aggressively built out infrastructure, cut tariffs, and offered these huge tax incentives. This directly countered the prevailing dependency theorists of the 60s and 70s, who were constantly warning developing nations that foreign investors would just exploit their cheap labor and extract resources. Lee took the exact opposite bet, fostering a relentlessly business-friendly environment. And to support that massive gamble, they built a vital institutional framework piece by piece. Look at this timeline. In 1961, even before the separation from Malaysia, they established the Economic Development Board to actively court those foreign investors. And then, crucially, by 1970, the National Wage Council was formed. This was key because it ensured that the economic benefits of all this foreign investment were actually shared with the workforce, which kept society stable and really accelerated Singapore's move up the development ladder. But you know, this strategy was constantly evolving. As Lee Kuan Yew once told the King of Bhutan, "It's not how you start the journey that counts, but how you arrive." And by the 1980s and 90s, man, that journey had dramatically shifted. They moved completely away from labor-intensive stuff like garments and textiles and pivoted straight into high-tech chips, wafer fabs, and building Singapore into a premier global financial center. And that new status was built explicitly on international credibility, efficiency, and a super strict rule of law. Moving on to part 3, authoritarian pragmatism, the cost of stability. Okay, now we have to neutrally examine the flip side of this economic miracle. Lee's unyielding commitment to material wealth was achieved through a strategy that media scholar Cherian George calls calibrated coercion. See, Lee wasn't really interested in heady concepts of liberty. His favorite question wasn't, is this right? It was, so what? Will it work? He was constantly exchanging democratic freedoms for guaranteed survival and economic success, basically managing state control just intelligently enough to keep the general public satisfied. And the result of this pragmatism is totally undeniable. You get a highly prosperous city-state with clean air, exceptionally safe streets, and amazing schools. But as we see here, it is a society operating strictly under a very peculiar brand of soft authoritarianism, one that was molded entirely in Lee's image over his 31 years as prime minister. His political philosophy on this was shockingly blunt. He said, "You can't fill stomachs with liberty, but you can chew up those who use it to oppose you." Having seen firsthand how power was wielded during British colonial rule and the Japanese occupation, Lee believed that filling stomachs was absolutely paramount. And to protect that economic mission, he utilized the colonial-era Internal Security Act to arbitrarily detain hundreds of alleged communists, political opponents, and racial extremists over the years, completely bypassing the need for a trial. The political impact of those methods is just staggering. In 1963, more than 100 opposition figures from the left-wing Borisan Socialist Party were detained in a massive security sweep. This effectively crippled the political opposition overnight. So by the 1968 elections, Lee's People's Action Party won 58 out of 58 parliamentary seats. The opposition was completely hollowed out, and get this, the ruling party hasn't lost an election since. Lee even extended this absolute rigid control right into the labor markets. He forged this industrial peace by locking the government, employers, and unions into a very strict, unified partnership. Now, sure, it guaranteed massive economic stability, but it also effectively outlawed labor strikes entirely, keeping an incredibly tight lid on any worker dissent. So despite these severe authoritarian methods, American journalist Tom Plates captures a really common global perspective on this. While the West might heavily criticize the lack of civil liberties and the total suppression of opposition, the undeniable reality of that incredible prosperity makes it really, really hard to just neatly categorize or dismiss Lee's legacy. Ultimately, the sheer scale of the achievement somehow seems to dwarf the critique.
Finally, Part 4, Singapore's Changing Future, Shifting Demands.
The central underlying tenet of Lee's benevolent authoritarianism was always pretty simple. Keep the people well fed and they won't revolt. But what happens to that formula when modern grievances start piling up? Real cracks have formed in the social contract over the last decade. House prices have surged dramatically. Income inequality remains stubbornly high. There is intense, perennial frustration over competition with foreign workers. And perhaps most importantly, there's a massive generational shift happening. Younger citizens who have only ever known stability are beginning to seriously question the strict sacrifices and political limits being demanded of them. And Lee Kuan Yew himself recognized this growing disconnect before he passed. Speaking about voters under 30, he acknowledged, with what sounded like a distinct tinge of sadness, that they basically felt he was just selling them a line to make them work harder. He flat out said, "The problem is they don't believe. They think I'm wrong." The master chef fully knew the tastes of his patrons were changing.
So, to conclude our explainer today, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Now that the patriarch is gone, what happens next? Scholars like Joseph Lau believe that the ruling party's deeply ingrained pragmatism, which was gifted to them by Lee, will force them to adapt to survive these new voter demands. But the lingering question we all have to ask is, can this tightly calibrated system of soft authoritarianism truly endure and continue to thrive without its master chef in the kitchen? Thanks for digging into this explainer with us today.